Hello, in this Coolgrad video, we're going to talk about change request management and enhancement request management in software projects. So this video is useful for people who are going to the IT industry. It's also useful for software professionals, project managers, operations managers, business analysts, developers, and anyone who works in any standard IT project, whether it's waterfall or agile. Preferably, this process works for agile methodology, and it's very useful. It's one of my videos that I have about how things work in the IT industry. So you might have watched my videos about the QA best practices training and about the agile best practices. If you haven't already watched them, it might be very useful for you to watch them before you watch the change request management video. So in this video, we're going to talk all about change requests, enhancement requests, and how they should be received, how they should be handled, escalated between different levels, and how, if a change request is rejected, what do you do, and how to close out a change request. So it's all about change management. So I hope you find this video very useful when you're launching your software project in multiple releases. So every time there's a release, there's going to be change requests that come after that, and a lot of organizations don't know what to do with change requests. So let's take a look. First of all, what is the agenda of this change management training? How change requests, a CR is a change request, okay? In this video, I'm going to talk about CRs all the time. Change request, and ER is enhancement request. So how CRs must be handled, how enhancement requests must be handled, possible issues in current CR handling process. So what are the probable problems you're currently having in the IT industry, in your project? What might be the current problems and how to solve them? Which tool must be used, like ServiceNow or Rally, or what tool to use for change request handling? Levels of escalation of a CR and an ER. How many levels should they be handled in before they are closed out? How to validate a CR or ER. Process to approve or reject a CR or ER. What happens when a CR or ER is rejected? How CR releases happen. What is a CR and ER? A change request. CR is a request to change some functionality or the manner in which something is currently being accomplished in the application at a functional or architectural level after going live. Enhancement request is a request for new functionality that was not requested or developed before going live. So in any software project, suppose you're working for a customer, a client, they give you the business requirements in a BRD, business requirements document, or set of business process flows, or like a whole lot of documentation telling you what exactly they expect from this project. So there is a standard scope of work, and then the implementation partner or the system integrator who is implementing the project, they usually prepare the statement of work based on their understanding of the requirements, and once they review it with the customer and then it's signed, it's frozen, so you can't change the scope of work after that. So there are various dimensions to project management. So there is the scope of work, the timeline, the quality, the resources, stakeholder satisfaction, and of course the budget. So there's at least 6 different dimensions of project management. And if a project has to be successful, it has to be successful in all these dimensions. So if the customer asked for this much scope of work, so this much scope in the project, you have to deliver all the functionality requested. Not more, not less. And if you committed to do the project in this budget, say $2 million, you have to do it in $2 million. If you overshoot the budget, it's still a failure. And you have to meet the quality. You have to make sure there are not too many defects open after going live. So the quality standards have to be met. And then you have to meet the timeline. If you agree to do the project in 2 years, you have to do it in 2 years. If you exceed the timeline, it's still a failure. And you have to make sure the stakeholders are happy. And you have to make sure your resources, your team members are also happy. If you overwork your team members, they're complaining, then also you're a failure. So project management is not easy. And one of the most important aspects of quality of a project is the scope of work. So suppose the customer asks you to design a shoe made of silver, of a particular size, particular design, particular dimensions, a shoe. You have to give him what he asked for, a silver shoe of those dimensions. You shouldn't be thinking, oh, if I give him a shoe made of gold, he's going to be happier. He's like, hey, no, I wanted a silver shoe. So a lot of project managers who are young and inexperienced make this mistake often. They try to please the customer by going all out and giving him more than he asked for, but it might actually be something that the customer didn't want, or it might actually be affecting him negatively. So you have to get the scope of work frozen and deliver exactly what you agreed to deliver. And if the customer changes, suppose the project is like 80% done, and then this customer says, I asked for this silver shoe of these dimensions, and I forgot to say I want like some kind of a decoration, an embellishment, a jewel at one corner of the shoe. So now you have to add that. Hey, that was not in the original scope of work. So that comes in as a change request. And suppose when the project is 90% done, he says, I asked for the shoe to be like flat, but now I decided I want a 2-inch heel on the shoe. So that requires a lot of design changes, right, at the fundamental architectural level. So you have to redo a lot of things to introduce the heel. So then the team decides, that comes in as like a change request. So you see, adding a jewel on top of the shoe is like an enhancement request. You don't have to really change anything, just add it on, right? Add on. So that's an enhancement request. But if they ask for a change, like suddenly they ask for a heel in the shoe, so you have to redo the design of the shoe, and you have to get more material to make the heel and change the design, and then whatever you have done so far, you have to undo some of it and then redo it. So you have to do the cost, benefit, need analysis, for this entire change request. And then you give the customer, okay, I can give you the heel, but it's going to cost you this much more money, and it's going to take this much more time to do it. And these are the possible effects on the quality. It's going to take so much more time to, test it out. And these are the effects it will have on the entire product functionality. So you explain it to the customer, and if they still approve it, they have to give you more money and more resources and more time and agree to the change request. So this is how a change request or an enhancement request works. So I hope you got the difference between a change request and an enhancement request. Change request is like when initially they specified something in the user stories or in the business requirements, and then they change it. So you have to modify what you have done. That's a change request. Enhancement request means they give you some new functionality that was not requested before. You just add it on to the existing functionality. So that's the difference between a CR and an ER. And we're going to talk about how to handle CRs and ERs. So these are the abbreviations I've used in my presentation. BST means Business Support Team. It does the first level of CR handling. So most organizations have a first level of, usually junior resources, who get all this CRs, change requests, enhancement requests, and they do the first level of handling. They make sure all the duplicates are filtered out, and then they verify if it's a valid CR or a valid ER, and then they escalate it to the product owners. So they do the first level of screening. So you don't want to employ very expensive resources to do this. So usually the business support team is what does the first level of CR/ER handling, because you don't want to waste the product owners and the business owners' time in doing this basic filtering and handling. And then there's the product owner. PO means product owner. Product owner is from the business team, so a project may have multiple product owners for each track. They give you the business requirements, write the user stories, and make sure from a business perspective it's working fine. Business owner who manages all the product owners. So business owner is like one level above all the product owners. So he makes sure all the product owners are, usually the product owners may report to a business owner, and he is the next level of escalation. BSA, Business Systems Analyst, who translates business requirements into system level specifications. So the business requirement guy says, I want all this software functionality to work this way. And the business systems analyst is the one who explains to the business product owners and the business team about the pros and cons of doing it in different ways, and then he translates the business requirements into system level specifications. He writes down, what object, what class, how to code, and gives all the details to the technical team so the developers can code what is asked to code. A change request. A CR is change request, ER is enhancement request. So these are the abbreviations I've used in this presentation. Who can initiate a CR or ER? So suppose a project has got multiple phases in which they go live. So the entire project doesn't go live at once. Suppose it's a software project like a Salesforce project. So they have like a sales cloud usually and like a service cloud, and they have different modules such as, say, help desk module. You know how a call center runs. That's one module. The field service module. Suppose they have some equipment on the field which you send people out, field service engineers, to repair the equipment. Give them a work order and send them to fix it. That whole thing is one module, field service. Suppose they have one module about training and education. So we have to train the customers how to use the equipment. That whole thing is a training and education module. And then there's one department for, say, one module for contracts and warranties. So when the contract is about to expire, they renew the contracts, and then the warranties, they lay out the terms and all these things. That's one department. The sales is one department. Pre-sales is another department. Marketing is another module. So there are various modules. So if they are implementing a Salesforce or any CRM project, for example, maybe the sales cloud, the one module will go live first. After 2 months, the marketing piece will go live. And then after 3 months, the customer portal goes live. And then there is the help desk module which goes live after 1 month. And then, these things might be happening in parallel. And then the field service goes live after 5 months. So it can be done in phases, different releases. So when you have a bunch of functionality and you release it, you put it to production, that's like a release. So let's say a particular module has gone live, like say the help desk module. Okay, that part of it is designed and all the business, everything is working fine, tested, the UAT, the user acceptance test is done, and the help desk module has gone live. So the other things are still in development, okay? So after it has gone live, they start people start using it, and then they realize we should have done it differently, or we should add this new functionality. They come up with all these things after going live. It happens all the time. So it comes in as like change requests and enhancement requests. So who can initiate a CR or ER? Product owners. So there's all these product owners, different, who handle different modules. So let's say the help desk part of it has gone live. But then the field service guy realizes, he's the product owner for field service. He realizes he needs this functionality to be available in the help desk module so that he can get his work done. They forgot something in the help desk module. So he can initiate a CR or ER. So any product owners can initiate. And then business owners. Come on, he's like the boss of all the product owners, okay? And if he wants to initiate something, of course he can initiate it. And business systems analysts, they realize from a system or functional or business perspective, there is something that needs to be changed, which affects the overall functionality, or there's something enhancement that needs to be done. They can always initiate a CR or ER. Technical architects, there's something missing from the technical side, so they can initiate a change request. Executive management, the sponsors, the management, they can also initiate CRs and ERs. And usually the organization might open it up to all the end users. So there may be a field service engineer somewhere who can initiate a CR. Or they may say the help desk, the call center guy, he could also initiate a CR. If there's something required, like say for compliance reasons, it's not there, he can initiate a CR, I guess. So it depends on the organization policy, whom they want to allow to initiate CRs and ERs. So depending on the organization, any of these people could, or more, could initiate a CR or ER. So common issues in CR handling. The BST is not well trained on the business processes to determine if a request is a valid CR, ER, or like a CR defect. So it's good to invest some time and train the BST, business support team, on the business processes. So when they get a request from all these people, okay, they're supposed to say, okay, this is related to this particular user story. This was the original functionality requested in the user story, and this is requesting that this functionality be changed. Have they already received a request like this? No. so it's not a duplicate. So does this seem valid? Probably. So they can say, okay, it passes through the first level of validation, and they create a user story saying this is probably a CR or an ER. So it's like the BST has to be well trained on the business processes and the underlying system architecture and the overall big picture of the project for them to be able to do the first level of validation of change and enhancement requests. So many duplicate requests received as end users do not have access to a list of already existing CRs. So suppose there is some glaring glitch, okay? There's some functionality that was done in a particular way and it needs to be changed. And all the field service engineers who are using it, they all know about this. So you don't want like 1,000 field service engineers submitting the same CR, right? You would want to educate them to review the list of already submitted CRs, and then only if it's already not submitted, then they submit it, right? You want to filter out duplicates. So whatever CRs have been like validated, you have to create them as user stories, and somehow you have to provide an access to these end users so they see the list of all submitted CRs, or at least a brief summary of all submitted change and enhancement requests. So before submitting, they say, oh, somebody's already submitting it, okay, I don't have to submit it. So that prevents a lot of duplicates, prevents a lot of resources, time in filtering out duplicates. So please make sure your end users have an access to the summary of already submitted CR and ER tickets, okay? So most requests are escalated directly to product owners instead of BST. So suppose all these people, they are friends of the product owner, or they've known the business owner for 20 years or something. So they directly send emails to the product owners and business owners. You know, they send it by email or like phone calls. They submit all these requests. And then what happens? It slips through the cracks. And all these requests, sometimes the product owner forgets about them. They delete the email by mistake, or they just forget to act on it. There's no proper tracking system. So you must have one particular system using one particular tool, say Rally or Jira or TFS or ServiceNow, any particular tool. And then all the change requests must be submitted only that way. Otherwise, you can't guarantee that it will be handled. So product owners are expensive resources, and they must not waste their time reviewing requests to validate them and determine how to handle them. So you don't want people who are billed at say $100, $150 an hour wasting their time filtering out duplicates and doing the first level of CR handling. That's more like a business support team, BST's job, okay? Common issues in CR handling. So product owners, there's some more issues. Product owners receive many requests from end users via emails, and these are hard to track. We already talked about that. So let's say it must be submitted to Rally, for example, all the change requests. If you haven't opened up Rally to all the end users, how will they submit it? Or if you're using ServiceNow, you have to open it up to all these end users who are going to submit change requests. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of problems because the requests slip through the cracks. Some requests received via emails may not have been logged as change request tickets and may slip through the cracks. We talked about that. Product owners create new user stories to handle change requests in Word documents and attach them to CR tickets. It happens sometimes. So, once the submitted change request goes to the first level of validation, if it's a valid CR or ER, the product owners have to create user stories for this CR. So, if it's a valid CR, they have to create user stories to handle them. Sometimes, if they get a CR through an email, they just create a user story in a Word document and they think they can just attach it later on. And then it's difficult to again duplicate the data into the story, and then it's difficult to track it, and things like these happen. So the proposed change CR management process. This is the standard process which I propose based on years of experience and having successfully implemented this in multiple organizations. Define roles and responsibilities of various members in CR management. So in change request handling, which team member is going to do what? Define roles and responsibilities clearly in the process. BST does the first level of handling, list out all the things they do. Product owners do the second level of handling, so list out everything they should do. And then the business owners, what all they should do. And then what does the developer do? What does the business analyst do? List out roles and responsibilities very clearly, so there's no scope for ambiguity. Specify the levels of escalations of CRs. Some organizations may have only 2 levels of escalation. say BST and the product owners, and then there's no more escalation. Some organizations might want to do a third level of escalation. Some organizations are hybrid, so they classify their change requests into high impact and low impact CRs. So if it's low impact, the product owners can make all the decisions, approve them, get them done, including giving them the budget if required. But if it's a high impact CR, then it goes to the business owners. So different organizations do it differently depending on how many levels of escalation they want. So how to perform cost benefit need effort analysis for CRs before the final approval. So for every CR which is especially high impact, the product owners, business owners have to determine what is the cost of implementing it, budgeting, and then the benefit. What is it, just incremental benefit or like a large amount of benefit? The need. Do we really need this at this point of time? Effort. How many resources do we need? How much time is it going to take? Is it worth it? So then they do this entire analysis and decide if it's worth approving it or not. How to manage CR user stories. So it has to go through the entire life cycle before it's closed out. How to perform emergency fixes on support sandbox and release to production. So suppose on production, the help desk module has gone live and they are doing things in a particular way, and the compliance team is really aghast. They're like, oh my God, you guys are doing it this way. The compliance officials are going to come after us, for ISO compliance, whatever, and they're going to, beat the hell out of us because this is not going to work for compliance. Hey, how could you let this? We didn't think of this earlier. So we have to do an emergency fix. You can't wait to put it, fix it in development, again test it, UAT it, and again go into production during CR release. So you have to fix it emergency. It's called a firefighter CR or like a hot fix. Fix it in a sandbox and then put it into production. Emergency handling. So then define a process to convert very high impact and major CRs into spin-off projects. Sometimes after going live, people realized they screwed up early on and they didn't realize it. So sometimes these change requests are so big. It's not only because somebody screwed up or didn't think. It could be that, the functionality, the requirements changed. Suppose an organization was not, was not worried about ISO compliance at the time of launching the project. But after 8 months, they decided to get, ISO 9001 certified and then ISO 14001 certification, all these certifications. And for those certifications, they might need to change the functionality in a certain way. It's possible. So at that time, they didn't need it, but now they need to change it to this new thing. So this change request might be so big that it has to spin off into a separate project. It happens. How to plan CR releases. So these change requests are grouped, and when a sizable amount is done, like say every quarter, they might have a CR release. So you want to plan how these change requests are released. Handling emergency hot fixes. So, it was similar to what we talked about here, firefighter CRs. So, how to submit a CR or ER? So, any end user wants to initiate a change request. In what form do they submit it? Create a separate folder like in Rally. I'm going to assume that the tool we're using here is Rally, okay? You could use Jira or TFS or ServiceNow or any tool for that matter. For this presentation, I'm just going to use the example of Rally. So create a separate folder for users to submit CRs. So it all has to come into like a particular, you tell them in which portion of Rally to go visit. So there's this probably epic story or feature or something. Under that you put all the CRs. So if they are submitting it as a defect, you create like say a sample one user story. Usually it's good to capture CRs as defects. So in the defect, there's this expected result, actual result. A defect is usually something that goes wrong. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that. It can be captured as a user story or as a defect. So if they're writing user stories for CRs, the user story has to go through a life cycle and be closed out. What I suggest is capture CRs as some kind of custom defects. Like you can create a defect which has custom fields, which says existing functionality and desired functionality. Instead of saying expected result, actual result. It's not necessarily the result of a testing effort. So they tried to use the system after it went live. And then this is the existing functionality and this is the desired functionality. So they submit a change request or an enhancement request. And often the end user is not qualified enough, competent enough to determine whether it's a CR or an ER. He just submits the request. So it comes in as a defect, for example, and it's like a generic CR in Rally in a standard format. End users often will not be able to classify a request as a CR or ER, but will place it a generic CR defect. They just put it in Rally, okay, in one place, tied to this user story. When the generic CRs are reviewed by the BST, only valid requests are handled by creating specialized CR/ER stories. So the generic CRs are reviewed by the BST. All these which come as defects, they're captured, and then they're all reviewed by the BST. And the BST, business support team, they go through all these CRs and ERs and filter out the invalid ones, and the ones which are valid, they put them as user stories in one particular folder under one feature in Rally. They create CR/ER user stories, okay? And then these generic CR, if it's determined to be invalid, it's closed as invalid. And then you inform the submitter that this was an invalid CR or ER for this particular reason. The BST rejects it and gives it back to the submitter. And what the submitter does after rejection, there is a whole slide that talks about that later, okay? So, prevent duplicate request submission. So all end users must be able to view the list of existing CRs and ERs in all states. So even if a CR has become a spin-off project, or CR has become a user story which is now in testing phase, so whatever state it is in, all the CRs and ERs which have been submitted, they must be reviewed. They must be, the summary of it must be available to all the end users so that they don't waste their time submitting duplicate requests. So we already talked about it. It reduces the overload in identifying and eliminating duplicate requests. So, levels of escalation of CR and ER. Typically 3 levels of escalation for all valid CRs and ERs. So the BST, business support team, performs initial review, and the second level of review is the product owners. And optionally there could be a third level of review from the business owners. They review the detailed cost benefit need effort analysis for each CR/ER and approve or reject them. Process flow for CR/ER management. So this is an overview of the process flow in a diagrammatic way. So user submits generic CR as a defect in Rally, and then the BST reviews and validates the generic CR. So later I'm going to talk about the validation criteria in detail. So basically they determine through a well-defined set of rules whether the generic CR is valid or not. So if it's valid, the BST categorizes the request as a CR or ER to the best of using their judgment. Is it a CR or ER? So if it's a CR, they have to say which user story does this relate to and which functionality are we trying to change. And if it's enhancement request, if they could not find any user story which requests that kind of functionality, it comes in as a new request for functionality, then they say it's an ER. So using their best guess and judgment, based on all these criteria, they classify it as CR or ER, and if it's valid, they create a user story in Rally, which is called a CR user story or ER user story. Then the BST creates specialized CR/ER user stories for this request and escalates it to the PO. So they create the user story and then they inform the PO. Usually we have this feature called hot potato. If you look at my Agile best practices training, you'll know what it is. It's like a drop down of all the team members' names. So you give someone a hot potato, it means that you want to alert them to something, you need some action from them. So the PO gets a hot potato saying, there was this new CR user story created, take a look at this and validate it. So the PO has to respond and then give the hot potato back to the person who gave it to him. So the PO reviews and validates specialized CR or ER user stories. So second level of PO review is done. And then if it's a valid CR, what does the PO do? He could escalate it to the BO saying, hey, I've done my analysis, I think it's valid for all these reasons, and I've done my cost benefit need effort analysis. Now I would like the BO to review it. So then the BO reviews and validates the specialized CR/ER story. BO says, hey, I also think it's valid, we should get this done. And he approves the budget. Mainly the difference is like he approves and sanctions and gives them the budget and the resources and the timeline to do this. And then if it's valid, then the CR/ER user story is developed, tested, and it goes through the life cycle and then it's closed. So this is the happy path. So suppose the BST reviews and validates a generic CR and it's not a valid CR. So BST rejects it. And then Rally automatically emails the submitter of the request rejection. Submitter accepts the rejection. He says, oh yes, this is invalid. It is a duplicate, or it's not a valid CR or a valid ER, or there's not enough cost benefit need or effort need for this, so it's an invalid CR. So he says, yeah, I agree, it's invalid, and then the BST closes out the CR, the defect or user story, saying it was invalid. Suppose the submitter says, hey, I think it's valid, why do you say it's invalid? I want to get this done. So what can the submitter do? Submitter requests the CR team to reconsider the request, provides additional info, escalates to his manager if needed. Suppose the field service engineer submitted a CR and then it was rejected, but he thinks, hey, I need this done. So the field service engineer can escalate it to his manager to be the point of contact and provide more information and convince the business team to get this implemented, or he can himself provide additional info and try and get it done. So for whoever, whatever he needs to do, he does. If he doesn't accept the rejection, and then he resubmits it to the business support team, and the BST again validates it with the additional info or the new point of contact. So how many times can they keep doing this resubmission? Theoretically, infinite number of times, but then practically, you might want to limit it to like 3 times. You can repeal and resubmit it 3 times. Otherwise, if it's still considered invalid, it's invalid. That's what we do for practical purposes. So then they validate it again, and then the BST thinks, okay, with this additional information, I think now it's a valid CR. So then they escalate it to the PO. PO does this determination and sees if it's a valid CR. But the PO thinks, hey, no, this is not valid. So he can still reject it. And then Rally auto-notifies and the submitter. But the submitter escalates it to his manager and provides more information. And again, it has to go through every level of escalation. Again, it goes to the BST. And the BST thinks, you know what, I think it's valid. And then it goes to the PO. PO thinks, now it might be valid. It goes to the BO. And the BO thinks, no, it's not valid. It still goes through the rejection. Or if the BO thinks it's valid, then it's approved. So this is basically the flow. And we're going to take a look at different validation criteria and what criteria they use to determine if a CR or ER is valid or invalid. BST review. All generic change request tickets must be reviewed first by the BST. The BST creates specialized CR, ER user stories where required. So if the generic request is invalid, the BST can send the appropriate response to the submitter with a reason. They have to say why it was invalid, and then they reject it. And whether valid or invalid, based on the specific criteria, all generic change requests must be closed out within, like say, 72 hours of submission, or as per standard turnaround time in SLA. So whatever CRs come in, they have a standard turnaround time. Within 24 hours or 48 hours, all the CRs must be attended to. Either it's marked valid or invalid. So the BST has these rules according to which they must function. So validation criteria for generic CRs. So what criteria must the business support team use to determine whether a CR is valid or invalid? Duplicate. If it's a duplicate of an earlier submitted CR or ER, or a specialized user story, so we provide the link to this already existing submitted request, and we say for this reason it's a duplicate, and then it's rejected. Already existing functionality. So sometimes the customer, the submitter, the end user thinks he's asking for a change or something new. He doesn't realize that this functionality already exists. Maybe he just doesn't know how to use the system. It happens all the time. So this is already existing functionality. What you're asking for is already in the system. You just didn't know how to use it. So they say already existing functionality, and then they mark it as invalid and reject it. Conflicting with other current required functionality. So something is being done in a particular way, and the end user says, I want it changed to this. And you say, we cannot change it to this because it's going to affect some other modules. And for our project, we need these aspects of functionality to work in this particular way. And therefore, we cannot give you what you asked for because it conflicts with other functionality, existing functionality. So you reject it as invalid. And if none of these 3 above are met and it's still invalid, then you say other, some reason. Like say, it might be some special reason, like right now we don't have the budget. What you asked for is a good thing to have, but then it's not significant enough, or maybe right now the management doesn't have the budget for this and they don't want to entertain this for the next 5 years, so it's rejected. So it could be any other reason. So we say other and we specify the reason and reject the CR for based on all these criteria. So if none of the above invalidation criteria are met for a generic request, the business support team must check the request against validation criteria. So validate the CR against some currently released UAT approved story, meaning there's some story that's already in production. So a list of stories which have moved to production. Validate the CR against all those stories. Review the functionality in these stories, for which ones are relevant to this, and say, is it requesting some functionality in this story to be changed? Then it's a valid CR. Or if none of this production stories have this functionality, it's asking for new functionality, then it's a valid ER. So BST uses the team member uses his judgment and classifies it as a CR, a valid CR, or a valid ER. So criteria for BST to reject generic CRs. BST must specify one of the following reasons to reject a generic change request. Duplicate of another existing request, or already existing functionality, conflicts with other current functionality, or some other reason. Okay, we already talked about this. Auto-inform the submitter of rejection. So you have to configure Rally or whichever tool you're using to set up automatic email notifications. So if the end user has submitted a CR, there must be a field with a drop-down which has his name, which says he is the submitter. There must be a field called submitter, so we know who the submitter is. And then you must configure Rally to send out a notification. If this CR is closed out or marked invalid, then automatically send an email to the submitter saying this is the reason it was marked invalid. So set up these auto emails. It's very useful and saves you a lot of effort. So submitter response to rejected requests. Submitter says, hey, I agree, it's a invalid request because it's a duplicate or because you can't do it. I get it. For whatever reason, I agree it's invalid, and then he informs the BST and the BST closes it out. So the matter ends there. Provided additional info to reconsider. Submitter added some more information. The request must go through all levels of review, BST, PO, and BO, regardless of which level they were rejected at. Escalates to his manager. Submitter puts the name of his manager as the submitter now because the manager is the point of contact. And then they also provide more information and they try and convince the business team to implement this CR or ER. Submitter response to rejected requests. So submitter can appeal up to like 3 times for practical considerations, or theoretically endless number of times. And then after 3 times, if it's still considered invalid, it's invalid. So format of a specialized CR user story. So we cross the stage where it's determined to be a valid CR or a valid ER. And what does the product owner do? He must create a specialized user story, or the business support team can create the user story and give it to the product owner. It might be actually better for the business support team to create a specialized CR user story, put in the details, what is requested, and put in the title of this CR ER user story, and then give it to the product owner. Product owner adds in more details and updates the story and deals with it. So this is these are all the fields in the CR or ER user story typically. Title. If it is CR, you put CR in the title, just so you know it's a CR or an ER. CR/project name. And then you say change the dash functionality. Put in a brief title which says change the notification functionality in this module, or change the way this is done. So we know, when you look at the title, you know what it's all about, the user story. And then original functionality. So details of how this functionality is currently implemented in the application with user story, epic story number if possible. So this is about the currently existing functionality. What is the current functionality? How is it being done? So link it to the user story which is currently implementing this functionality. Or copy paste those details over here saying with the story reference numbers. It might be linked to multiple stories. Put in all those details or links and say this is how it is currently being implemented. Desired functionality. Details of change requested in functionality. So these are all the changes requested. So in the particular field, add a custom field called desired functionality. Okay, these are all the changes we desire. Put in all there. How to implement change. Optional suggestions about how to implement this requested change in the application. So the product owner might also, or maybe the submitter might have submitted some details, or the BST might have identified some details about how this change request could possibly be implemented. So it could also come from the end user. Say, let's say the help desk module has gone live, and then the field service engineer says, this is the change request I need in this help desk module, and this is how you can possibly do it by changing this functionality in this way. Not necessarily at a technical level, but at a functional level. They can say how they want the change request implemented. Format of a specialized CR user story. So these are some more fields, okay? This is a continuation of the previous slide. PO in charge, the business team member in charge of this functionality. So who is the product owner in charge of this story? We put that. BO in charge, who is the business owner for this corresponding product owner? So we need details about who is the PO, who is the BO. We have to put create like drop downs and populate their names for these stories, just so they know they are in charge of the story. Need, the need for this change request, populated by the product owner before approval. Benefit, populated by the PO before approval. Populated by the product owner before approval. So the product owner does the need and benefit analysis. So they say why we need this, because it's critical for compliance reasons, or it's critical because it's affecting the field service engineer. They're not able to do their jobs because of this. So we need this. So you justify the need. Benefit. So if we automate this, say earlier it was manual and now we automate it. So it makes it so much easier. It provides agility, and it's very easy to do it. So I mean, this provides a lot of ease for all these employees. So this is the need, this is the benefit. The product owners have to populate all this. We have to create custom text fields in the user story, for like one text field which says this is the need, enter the need here, enter the benefit here. Effort, populated by an IT member or a technical architect as level of effort in number of hours required for implementing request. So usually the IT people or the technical people, or maybe sometimes even a business systems analyst or a project manager, they can do the effort analysis. Usually a technical person does it. So how much time does it take to implement this change in the system? How much development, how much coding, how much configuration, how much data migration do we need to do? And then they put in the level of effort. Say this takes 40 hours to do, this takes 2 months to do. So they put it in as a level of effort. So effort, how many resources do we need for how much amount of time? Cost, usually populated by a project manager or a development manager, and determine the monetary cost and number of resources required to implement this feature. So they say this would take this much time and I need this many resources. So by simple mathematical calculations, you say therefore it would cost me this much amount of money to implement this change request. So we do cost, benefit, need, effort. This entire analysis is done by the product owner, okay? And then what does the product owner do? He gives it to the business owner for next level of approval if required. So it's the same format for an ER user story, enhancement request user story. Except in the title it says enhancement request, okay? ER and the project name require this functionality. So we put details of reason to request new functionality. So the field is slightly different. So in the change request user story we say currently existing functionality and what is the desired new functionality, how you want it changed. But in the ER user story we say reason to request new functionality, why are you requesting this new functionality, and what is the new functionality requested, and then desired functionality. So this is the reason to request the new functionality and what is the functionality you're requesting, and then how to implement this requested feature, optional suggestions, and then who is the PO in charge, who is the BO in charge, just so they know they are the ones in charge of the story. Need, populated by the PO before approval. So he has to do the need, the benefit, the effort is done by the IT team, and then the cost, how much time how much money it takes to implement this. So these are all the fields in the ER user story. So all this is done before they give it to the BO for next level of approval. And if it's a low impact change request or enhancement request, the product owner may be able to, approve it or reject it by himself. So regardless of whether they approve or reject, they have to fill in these fields. And unless it's like a duplicate, maybe the BST guy couldn't identify this duplicate and the product owner identifies a duplicate, he doesn't have to populate all these fields. There's no need to do cost, benefit, need, effort analysis. We know it's a duplicate, so just reject it, okay? And close out the story. So, categorization of CRs and ERs. Low impact and high impact CRs. Minor configuration changes such as addition of fields, etc. that do not affect other functionality majorly. These are low impact CRs. And usually the product owners can do the approval for this. If it's going to take like half an hour to fix something, you don't want to waste the business owner's time asking for his approval. So BST validates it, the product owner approves it, puts in the basic cost, effort, need and benefit analysis, approves it, and it's done. If it takes like 1 hour, 2 hours to do it, you don't have to waste the product owner's, the business owner's time. But if it's a high impact CR or ER, then major functionality change that involves deletion of a field. Remember, addition of a field is probably easy, but when you delete a field, you don't know how it's going to impact all the other fields. So yeah, a lot of thought has to go into it. Customization. So we're customizing something at the code level. So, you want to think about it, how it's going to impact other modules. Interfaces. So, there are interfaces between various systems. Say between Salesforce and SAP, or SAP and Lotus Notes. There's all these interfaces between these systems. If the change request is related to an interface, then you'd want to probably run it by the business owner before you approve or reject it. Major effort typically involves more than a day to implement and affects other functionality heavily. So that's how you classify CRs into high impact and low impact CRs. How does the PO review a CR or ER? So the BST has validated it and gives it to the PO, the product owner. So the POs and BOs, they review the requests which come as user stories, and then the invalidation criteria for POs while reviewing CR, ER stories. So they first go over the invalidation criteria to see if this is invalid. Duplicate of another earlier submitted generic change request that was rejected or specialized CR, ER. So maybe the BST didn't identify the duplicate, and the product owner identifies the duplicate. It's still a duplicate, it's still invalid. So he can mark it duplicate and mark it invalid and reject it. Already existing functionality. So they're requesting this new enhancement or change request, and the BST thought it's a valid change request or enhancement request, but the product owner was able to identify that it's already existing functionality. So the product owner can mark it invalid. Conflicting with other current required functionality. So the BST thinks it's okay to do it, but the product owner knows better. Product owner thinks, hey, you want this functionality, but it would affect this other module heavily, so we cannot give you this because it conflicts with other existing functionality. So the product owner can use this reason to reject a CR or ER story. Need benefit insufficient. So there's not enough need for this at this time, or there's not enough benefit. We'd go through all this effort and put in 1 month to implement this. It gives us only incremental benefit. So there's not enough need or benefit. So that's enough reason to reject a CR or ER. Product owner can reject it. But the BST is not qualified to do the cost, benefit, need, effort analysis. It has to be done by the product owner or above. Other reason, any other reason. Maybe they have budget constraints. Maybe maybe like say the software is coming up with this new feature out of the box in about 8 months, so we don't have to waste our time implementing it. It could be any other reason. So specify the reason, and first when the product owner gets a change request story or enhancement request story, first thing they have to do is go over all these invalidation criteria. And if it's invalid for any of these reasons, they mark it invalid and reject it. And only then they try to validate it to see if it's valid. So if it's not invalid, then it's probably valid. So they validate the CR against some currently released UAT approved story. So the BST has probably put in the links to the story saying, hey, this is probably a change request related to this previously implemented story. So the PO identifies, product owner identifies all the stories which are currently in production, and they say, for all these reasons, these are the stories whose functionality is requested to be changed. and they mark it a valid CR. And valid ER is when they could not find the existing functionality in any user story and they ask for new functionality. So it's a valid ER. So the product owner says it's a valid CR or valid ER. How PO can reject a CR or ER? POs follow the same process for rejecting a CR or ER story as the BST, except they have 2 more reasons in the drop-down list. And a PO can also change a request type from CR to ER and vice versa. So the business support team thought it's a CR, but the product owner knows better. He says it's an ER, enhancement request. Or the business support team thought it's an enhancement request, but the product owner was able to identify a particular user story which already had this kind of functionality, and so they said it's really a CR. How PO can reject a CR or ER? So we went over some of these. It's either a duplicate, which the BST missed, already existing functionality, conflicts with other required current functionality, insufficient need benefit. How PO approves CRs and ERs? So the project or manager or development manager performs cost analysis. The IT member must then route the CR ER to the project development manager to populate the cost section of the artifact to specify the monetary cost of implementing the CR ER and which resources will be required to implement this request. So they do the cost analysis and then they do the routes it back to the PO for approval. So the cost analysis, the product owner might not be competent enough to do it. It might have to be done by the project manager. Even though the story is under the attention of the product owner, the project manager might come in there and put in the cost. So give a hot potato to the project manager, he comes in and puts in the cost details. And then the product owner may then approve it and then send it to the BO for final review. So how the business owner reviews CRs and ERs. The BO is the final authority, so he can either approve or reject. Okay, business owners, they do the detailed cost benefit need effort analysis, and then BOs must secure required resources and funding before approving a CR or ER. So this is important. Business owner can't just approve it and say, hey, do it. He has to procure enough resources, make sure the budget is approved before he approves a change request or enhancement request. BOs must determine if CR involves tremendous effort or cost and spin such CRs, ERs into separate projects per specific criteria. How BO reviews CRs and ERs? So what does the business owner do when he gets a user change request or enhancement request user story? So first he goes over all the invalidation criteria. Is it a duplicate? Maybe the BST missed it, the product owner missed it, but the business owner identifies it as a duplicate. It's still invalid and they reject it. Already existing functionality. So if both the BST and the product owner missed it, then the business owner might be able to identify it. Conflicting with other current required functionality. So if it can't be done because it affects existing functionality, then also they can reject it. Cost plus effort divided by benefit plus need, ratio too high. So the cost and effort is too much and the need and benefit is too less. So the cost, effort and need benefit ratio is too high. Means there's too much cost and effort for too little need and benefit. So they can still reject this CR or ER or some other reason. So this is what the business owner does. First go over the invalidation criteria. So how do BOs reject a CR or ER? It's the same as what the product owner does. That's what the business owner also does. They have one different reason in the drop-down list. So they have to have a list of options in the drop-down for rejecting a CR or ER. The business owner can change the request type from CR to ER or vice versa. And if a specialized CR story, if it's not really a CR but an ER, they can change it. Okay, the business owner can also do this. And reasons for business owners to reject a CR or ER. Duplicate. So they mark it as duplicate and mark it invalid and reject. Already existing functionality, so they can reject. conflicts with other current required functionality, reject. Cost plus effort divided by need plus benefit, the ratio is too high, then they can reject. When BO approves a CR or ER, BO must put in his comments in the actual number of resources required. The BO must determine that the CR must, if it's going to be spun off into a new project, he must create a new project and spin it off and provide all the resources and budget for the new project. So every time a CR/ER is approved or rejected by the business owner, corresponding product owners and the submitter must be notified by Rally via email and other means. Product owners must create a new user story in Rally for CR/ER that is approved by the business owners. So once the business owner has approved a CR user story or ER user story, they can move that story into the user story life cycle, which it goes into development, testing, and then released. But sometimes if it goes into a spin-off project, then they might have to create a new user story in a separate project, separate folder altogether. That's a whole story. They might reuse the story or create a new story. So depending on the situation. So managing CR/ER user stories in Rally. Create a separate CR/ER project in Rally for each release. So CR user stories can reside together under the same project for each release. The stories must be placed under the appropriate feature or epic story in the original hierarchical structure for better visibility on implementation. This will ease the metrics reporting for CRs/ERs per initiative and feature. So you want to know, your project is categorized into many initiatives and features. So for each feature, how many CRs were received, how many ERs were received. You want to report these things to the executive management. So it's good to place like a CR/ER folder under each feature, or somehow tied to the feature, because you want to have these metrics for reporting. So if a generic change request has been rejected by the BST, then you don't need to create a CR user story at all. So the CR/ER user stories will follow the same user story life cycle and go through sprinting, development, testing, UAT, and closure, release. If you look at my Agile best practices training, I have talked in detail about user story life cycle. So these BO approved CRs and ERs, they go through the same user story life cycle as in any other Agile project. So we already talked about the title of these user stories. We say CR or ER in the title, and then we write the business requirements, system acceptance criteria, architectural details, product owners. We say who's the product owner in charge, who's the business analyst in charge, who's the developer in charge, who's the tester in charge, and it goes through this entire life cycle. And then they make all these changes, and these are the different user story statuses. So if you want more details about the user story life cycle, that's an Agile process, review my Agile best practices video. So the user story status would be new, and then in grooming, and then where they populate all the details, and then it goes into development, testing, UAT, and then it's closed. And then it's released when the next CR release happens, it's released to production. So for all these CRs and ERs, we must have the equivalent of a UAT. So that's important. We have to plan the CR releases. Usually it happens once a quarter. Or you can also have like a minor CR release every month. Or you might have CR releases only every 4 months or every year. So it really depends on the company. Usually it's done every quarter. So we must have the equivalent of a UAT for CRs and ERs before each CR release. So all these CR user stories must be developed, tested, and then they must be the equivalent of a UAT, user acceptance testing. So they go through all that, and only once in a quarter we deploy all these changes to production. So you can't deploy every change request story to production as and when it's done. It has to be done as part of an aggregate release, which is done like every quarter, typically. So for CR stories which are spun off into new projects, that new project has a number, an ID. So this is important for the payroll department and the finance department, so they have to know where the money is going, right? So usually the drop down must be pre-populated with the project number and the project numbers of all the spin-off projects created. So in every CR user story, it's important to have this drop down. It's a custom field which says project number. and if it's belongs to the same project, suppose the name of the project was ABC, and this change request is also going to be in ABC, then you just say ABC, so the money is going to ABC project. Basically that's what they need to know. And if it's going to a spin-off project, it's a new project XYZ, so in the drop down you say this story now belongs to XYZ and you put it there. So basically the finance department would want to know like where the money is going, to which project, so you have to put the project number as a custom field. And how to plan CR releases. So you can have a minor release every month, mainly for releasing low impact CR stories if required, or you can club them and then have one major release every quarter, typically every quarter. So for example, Salesforce releases new features every quarter, and the management might decide to implement some new existing or functionality using these new features. So typically it makes sense to do it once a quarter. How to plan CR releases. So change management can typically happen for many years after a project has gone live. Create a parent-child relationship between CR ER stories. A designated team member must create CR release and rally for every planned CR release immediately after going live. So you have to create all these releases. CR ER stories must be tied as children to a CR release, unless they are firefighter CRs or CRs which were opened in error. So team must be able to see at least 3 future releases planned out in change management in rally. So tying a CR to a CR release. So remember that these change requests, we might get like hundreds or thousands of change requests. Some are critical in need, but they don't have to be done urgently. The severity is high, the criticality is high, but the urgency is not there. It can be done after 6 months. And some of them are low impact, but they have to be done like right now. So you pick up which story is going to which CR release, mainly depending on the priority and urgency. It's a combination of the two. You want to pick high priority stuff that needs to go first, the urgent ones, into the earlier releases. And what is low priority or which is not urgent, even if it's high priority, if it's not urgent, it goes into a later release. So every time a CR release is closed out, a new future CR release must be planned and activated till an end date is determined for the change management process. So firefighter CRs for emergency hot fixes. We talked a little bit about this, but what to do when there is an emergency problem in production environment that is critically affecting key functionality in the application. What to do when the team cannot wait until the end of the current CR release to fix the issue and deploy it into production. Suppose they've just had a CR release and they can't wait for another 2 months or 2.5 months or the end of the quarter for the next CR release. It has to be done before that. Then what do? You open a firefighter CR, and you can just in the drop down you can categorize it as regular or firefighter. So it's a firefighter CR. And resources have to be deployed ASAP, as soon as possible, to fix the critical issues directly on the support sandbox and push it into production. When to close CRs and ERs. So after the UAT, if the product owners do a smoke test, and then after it's released they do a smoke test, it's working fine, only then we close out the CRs. So till it's deployed and smoke tested, we cannot close out a CR or ER. So remember that CR/ER stories will usually have a much higher turnaround time than regular user story lifecycle. It takes more time to implement the CR stories or fix defect and migrate code to production. So regular user story lifecycle, in Agile we have these sprints, right? 2-week sprints or 3-week sprint. So they pick up a story, it's new, then it goes into grooming and then development and then tested, UAT, demoed at the end of the sprint. In 2 weeks the story is closed out. That doesn't happen in change management. So the story is closed out only at the end of every release, after it's deployed to production in the change release and then smoke tested, only then they close out the user stories. So that's typically the turnaround time, the user story life cycle time is much longer in change management. So the reasons to close out CRs and ERs. Successfully released. Yay, it was done, everything was done, it was approved and developed, tested, it's released, working fine, so we close it out. Rejected. The CR/ER was rejected, so the story is closed out. Firefighter. It was deployed to production and found to be working fine, then it can be closed, even though it's not tied to a CR release. Not required for production. When a BST member or somebody creates a specialized CR/ER in error. So he closes this, picking the reason saying, not required for production. It was created in error or something, not required for production. Close it out. So these are some other details to think about if you're implementing change management in your organization. Who is responsible for training the BST team? So business support team. For business processes and applications so that the product owners will not be overloaded with basic change request review work. Who is going to train the business support team? Think about that. And make sure they get good quality training. Process to convert very high cost impact CRs into spin-off projects. What are the criteria? Who's going to make these decisions? How do you spin it off into a new project? You have to lay out a process because your organization may be having hundreds of projects and you want to establish a well-defined process for spinning off change requests, enhancement requests into separate projects. It's important to lay out the process in advance, not at the last moment when your neck is on the line and you have this and you have to spin it off and then you wonder what to do. You have to plan it out in advance. So does this change request management process adhere to compliance standards? So you have to vet this process with the compliance team and make sure they're okay with it. So this brings us to the end of this video about change request and enhancement request management. I hope you got all the information you needed about CR/ER handling, and I hope this helps your organization with change management process. This is pretty much like the standard industry process in almost any organization. You can just customize it for different organizations based on compliance standards, based on their unique requirements. So this is also useful for students who are going to work in the IT industry. So if you're going to be a tester, a developer, a project manager, a business owner, product owner, a tech lead, whatever, or an architect, you might want to be familiar with the change management process. I hope you found this useful. Thank you.